Over the last 18 months, Europe has been hit with a series of terror attacks. After high-profile assaults in Paris, Brussels and Nice, Germany is now dealing with increased terror threats too, following a number of smaller incidences. And just last week, an elderly priest was murdered at his church in northern France. The continent is on edge. Europeans are concerned not just about their security, but also the political fallout that is still developing. We begin with CCTV correspondent Kate Parkinson, who joins us from Paris. Thanks, Kate, so much. We've seen these terror attacks across Europe, obviously. What's the mood like on the continent?
Well, people are understandably extremely concerned about the security situation here in Europe. Since June, there have been 7 attacks here in France. In the past 2 years, we've seen 14 attacks, killing more than 240 people, some of them, as you mentioned, very high-profile attacks. But in between, there have been much smaller but nonetheless deadly attacks taking place. Certainly when the French Prime Minister Manuel Valls said people in France may have to live with terrorism, he could have been speaking for the whole of the continent and for the United Kingdom. And this is very much the feeling across Europe, because intelligence agencies do warn that more attacks are expected, and the Islamic State terror group does release videos on a regular basis threatening to attack Europe. So it's certainly not a very comfortable position for people who are living here at the moment. And really this increase that we've seen lately in very low-tech, random but nonetheless deadly attacks is causing people to question whether their governments can tackle the terror threat or whether they're able to adequately discern who is a potential terror risk or who could potentially turn violent.
Yeah, and of course Europe's been dealing with the migrant crisis as well. Are these attacks having much impact on Europe's immigration policy debate, although it is worth emphasising that not many of the new immigrants have been ever linked to the terror attacks?
Well, you make a very good point, and it's something that the European leaders are keen to stress. The German Interior Minister has said that these recent attacks in Germany were not carried out by refugees who'd arrived in the past year or so. The same can be said of the attack in Nice, but it's not changing some people's perception that this tide of mass migration is not going to end well, and certainly the far-right parties are really capitalising on this. You only have to look at the situation in the United Kingdom, which last month voted to leave the European Union, to see that populism, nationalism and isolationism really are on the rise here in Europe.
Yeah, you're touching on the political fallout. What is it going to be like for mainstream leaders like German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President François Hollande, both facing elections, both hit in the polls under pressure?
Well, absolutely, and these really are the two leaders to keep an eye on, because they are the powerhouses of Europe, France and Germany, and both the French and German leaders are facing elections next year, so they will be put up to the public scrutiny in the ballot boxes. Certainly the position for both Hollande and Merkel is far from clear. Merkel very much changing her tune from being very welcoming towards refugees to being a bit more on the defensive now, saying that Germany does need to take a tougher stance on deporting people whose asylum claims have failed and doing a better job at spotting people who are becoming radicalised. Equally here in France, the French president, well, he was already under the spotlight for his leadership and security policies following last year's attacks. That has only increased in recent weeks. And while his popularity is at a record low, the leader of the far-right Front National Party, Marine Le Pen, well, her popularity is soaring, and she's emerging as a very strong contender for next year's presidential elections.
Very interesting. Thanks, Kate Parkinson from CCTV's Kate Parkinson, joining us there from Paris. And for much more, joining us now from Berlin is Volker Stanzel. He's a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He has extensive experience in German foreign policy. Also joining us from Paris is Asif Arif. He's director of the website Cultures and Beliefs, and he's the author of a soon-to-be-published book, France, Belgium, The Blurry Diagonal of Terrorism. And with me here in the studio is Matteo Garavoglia. He is an Italy Programme Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he holds dual Italian and German citizenship. Welcome to the show, all of you. Let's go first to Berlin. Volker Stanzel, you've seen in Germany a number of more low-level attacks recently. Germany not normally the site of terrorism. How is Europe's biggest country faring?
Well, you say Germany is not usually attacked. Of course, it has been attacked. There have been efforts by IS which have either been prevented by police or which just did not go off. The 4 attacks we just had in the course of 10 days are something quite different. And while I realize that it's just easy to categorize them as terrorist attacks, I'd like to emphasize this is not what they were. All 4 of them actually were perpetrated by people who had a mental condition and who would have run amok or would have attacked a girlfriend, as it was in one case, had they not had any migration background or IS background. That, I think, helps German society to prove relatively resilient to this kind of attack, because it so obviously is not what we feared would come from IS, and eventually it might indeed come. You know, 77% of the Germans believe an attack will be imminent. 56% believe police will manage to cope with it. But there is this consciousness that we're threatened, but these 4 attacks have not really contributed to an increase in the sense of being alarmed, or how would you call it? All 4, of course, have a migration background. One of them a German, but born of Iranian parents. So that, on the one hand, of course, leads people to fear that people with a migration background may be prone to that kind of mental instability because they're traumatized or what, and will demand measures to prevent that. On the other hand, of course, it gives us food for thought what kind of mentality people or what kind of state people are in who escape from a war situation, traumatized through months and months of being refugees in existential need. How would they behave in the future? So that is a big challenge if we really want to integrate them. And after all, last year we got 1.2 million refugees. It's a big task.
Asif Arif, Volker, they're giving a nuanced view. That isn't always evident, is it, in reaction to these attacks? In France, the president has said we are at war. There are feelings of fears on the street. How is the German experience differing from what France has been through in the last 18 months?
I mean, in some way, I can say for some, what happened in Nice, for example, was also made by a person who has a very bad mental condition, and then after Daesh comes and say yes, it is an attack from our organization. So I think yes, France has a more wider background with Daesh attacks, because Paris attacks had been revendicated by Daesh, but we cannot forget that what French people understand, and this is here is the central meaning of French society, is that they understand that Daesh is more afraid by our unity rather than, you know, intensifying bombing in Syria or whatever François Hollande is asking, because François Hollande and Manuel Valls, who's the prime minister, right after the attacks, they said, yes, we need to intensify our attacks in Syria. But I don't think the problem is in Syria. The problem is in France, and that's what French people understand today.
Asif, just a quick follow-up. I mean, obviously you have a very intelligent analysis of what's happened, but there is a lot of fear in France and elsewhere in Europe, lumping all these attacks together, including that horrific attack, of course, in the church that we saw last week. There is this perception amongst the public at large that they cannot be protected.
Well, you know, the protection is a very touchy subject over here. Yes, we tried the state of emergency. Yes, we tried a lot of measures named assignation à résidence, where you send people back to their home and they cannot move. Yes, we tried a lot of things in order to prevent this terrorist attack. But the problem over here, and I think this problem will grew up and touch all the European Union. The problem is you cannot prevent a man from doing something. For example, if we take the guy from Nice, he doesn't have any police background. He doesn't have any anything. He didn't commit any crime or something. So we couldn't say that he is going to do a terrorist attack. The guy was a dancer of salsa. So we cannot know which person, who are going to do these attacks. So this is the most complicated question to solve over here. But there is a second level of things as well, because amongst the population, yes, there is this fear how we will be protected. But there is also the civil population over France, the Muslim population, Christian population, especially after what happened in church. They went massively in the masses of different churches, and they show that they are ready to show a message of unity against Daesh. So I think we should also keep in mind that the civil population is still resilient. We should not give up on them. And basically, yes, they are afraid about what is going to happen in the future, but they are still very resilient.
Matteo, I want to bring you in here. Obviously, different reasons for these different attacks, but there is also the migrant crisis happening at the same time. And there seems to be a perception that somehow the growth of terrorism and the migrant crisis are somehow linked.
Well, there's certainly an interest on behalf of many more right-wing forces, more extremist forces, nationalist forces, and xenophobic circles to link the two, to merge the concept, the idea of migrants and refugees with terrorism. Actually, when we look at the data, there's very little to suggest that the overwhelming majority of migrants or asylum seekers have anything to do with terrorism. Indeed, a recent report that was published jointly by Interpol and Europol has said exactly that whilst we cannot possibly rule out that, that something might not happen involving asylum seekers, statistically, in terms of numbers, the evidence is very thin.
Volker Stanzel, Germany was lauded around the world last year when Chancellor Angela Merkel put up a big welcome sign for migrants and not sending them back to the first country of origin in the European Union, which would have been perfectly lawful. Is that policy being questioned now in the light of recent attacks?
Yes, it is. But before I get to that, let me just make a remark on what Asif has said, because I really like his expression of society being resilient. And this is something I really admire looking at France, which is hit much more severely than German society is. The resilience of mainstream society. But at the same time, I observe in France that right after the attack on the church, this was turned by politicians into electioneering. And I think this is difficult. This is dangerous even. And I hope in Germany we can escape that temptation. Politicians will not fall for that temptation. Now, of course, when Angela Merkel said a year ago, we will manage to do that. Well, speaking of welcome culture, that was lauded around the world, and in Germany itself. Nobody knew it would be 1.2 million. And nobody knew what it really meant to deal with this kind of influx, only speaking in, let's say, bureaucratic organizational terms. So now we're confronted with a lot of problems. We're confronted with threats, like these traumatized young boys. We had incidents in the past, like on New Year's Eve in several German cities.
Yes, like in Cologne. Volker, I just want to pick up. I just want to pick up on one point there. Was Germany not prepared for this? Because that seems to be a criticism that Germans hasn't been prepared for the migrant crisis, the influx of refugees, and could lead to resentment with incoming flows of people.
That's a good question. It's good that you raised that. Of course, mentally Germany was prepared. Organizationally, it was not. And who could anyone be prepared for figures like the ones we were faced with, and which at the time when the Chancellor made that statement, she and nobody else really knew. I mean, this is an administrative problem, and to solve this administratively just takes time. At the same time, the Chancellor said last week in her press conference, we will manage that, and we already have managed a lot, which is true, but which also shows a lot still needs to be done. And that is where the right-wingers that Matteo has spoken about, of course, find a way to criticize the Chancellor. Right-wingers and actually also left-wingers. How can you not be prepared for that kind of onslaught of people who might be dangerous? And how can you say we will manage that?
Welcome back to the show. We are talking about the recent spate of terror attacks that has Europe on edge this summer. And let's go back to Paris. Asif Arif, we ended the last block talking about the difficulties Germany has had in integrating migrants so quickly. What about Paris and France when it comes to monitoring terror threats? Because a lot of homegrown terrorists have come to the fore. It creates tremendous manpower to monitor these sort of threats. Can France do better, or is it doing enough already?
Well, I think the problem over in France is not about, our refugees, as, for example, what Germany is facing. I mean, I don't think it's a proper problem, but whatever it's called, we don't have this type of issue. But I think in France, the problem is the integration of our communities, because the problem in France is the Republic, the French Republic, do not recognize any community. So they live into this ideal society where no one can define themselves by community, but they define themselves by being French. So this brings up in a huge way, a big debate on the concept of identity. And since this debate on the concept of identity start, then we face all this peculiar problem with the migrants. So extreme right wings, led by Marine Le Pen, will say we should cut all our links to the European Union while sitting in the European Parliament. She will so. We should stop having any migrants. We should close our borders. But, this is not the way of dealing with things over here in France. I think we look after the pros and cons in our politic of integration and minority integration, and we should promote more diversity in our society, because it's totally possible. French is a very diverse society, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like in the political speech that we are going to have more and more to talk about diversity, but we more and more have talk about background and history of France, saying, for example, Marine Le Pen saying that we belong to the Christian history, but we are not. French people do not want to talk about the past. They want to talk about the future, and the future of France is the diversity.
We could spend 2 hours on the history of Europe and its peoples, but Matteo Garavoglia here in the studio. Is there a lesson then to be learned between the earlier waves of migration into Europe, particularly France in post-colonial days, and the ones we're seeing now? Asif suggested that the integration hasn't happened properly among that first wave and has led to resentments and some homegrown terrorists who are citizens now, but the children of immigrants a long time ago. Are there lessons to be learned here?
I do believe there are, and here I think we can look at all this issue of handling the migrants or refugee crisis on a short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Integration is a long-term issue, and that is still, and it is likely to remain for the foreseeable future, a matter for national governments. So the integration policies that have been pushed forward over the years by the French government are entirely different from the ones that have been tried out in the United Kingdom, for instance, or in Germany, on the other hand.
Well, the United States, for example, says it's much better at integrating immigrants than European powers. Is that true?
I think we have to be careful with the semantics. The United States is a country of immigration, and in that respect, it does well. It is a country that traditionally has taken in relative terms, far less asylum seekers and refugees, actually, than most European countries. So it's two different things.
Carry on.
This is the long-term issue, so migration and integration of migrants, and that is for national governments to deal with. We also have short-term issues and medium-term issues. On the very short term, of course, the one thing that is crucial now is to secure and manage Europe's external borders, and good work has been done in that respect. We have a lot of stuff in the pipeline whereby by the end of the year we should have a brand new European border and coast guard in place. So I would expect that by the summer of 2017, next year, Europe's borders should be managed in entirely different ways, and that should be a significant step forward. That is something for 2016, early 2017. On the medium term, of course, what we need to look at is a radical reform of the common European asylum system. There are a number of proposals that have been brought forward by the European Commission. The difficulty, though, is a political one, whereby we have a split across Europe. There are certain member states that are ready to push forward to integrate their common asylum refugee policies to a certain extent, and others that are less ready to do so.
I'm so glad you said that, because I really want to dwell on this. Volker Stanzel, you have, of course, the European Union, 28, now going to be 27 countries with Brexit. There are very different national policies on how to deal with terrorist threats and also the migration crisis as well. Is Europe somehow, because it has to deal with along consensus, not able to satisfy the political demands of its citizens in a timely way?
Well, the basic problem may be the tendency towards renationalization, isn't it? I think we've two major problems here. One is that people in any European country want simple answers. Problems seem intractable, dangerous, uncontrollable, and I myself have that feeling too, of course. So politicians are tempted to try for simple answers, short-term solutions, which are not really there. But it leads our countries, in any European countries, in a way that will sort of possibly destroy the very fabric of the European Union, if not even our societies. And I think Britain, with the Conservative Party trying to preempt UKIP, and the grand old party in the United States trying to preempt the Tea Party, show us where this can lead. I hope the rest of Europe, the 27, will not go that way. But please let me come to my second point, which is what can Europe really do? One thing is political leadership. Political leadership cannot pretend that there are short-term solutions when there aren't any. Even protecting our borders, which is very good, Matteo has just outlined it, is not really working long-term. Long-term means solving the problems in the Middle East. And here, I think a lot of the influential countries in the region have been too much part of the problem than part of the solution. So Europe, much more actively, in the way it now cooperates with Turkey, needs to cooperate with Saudi Arabia and with Iran at the same time, in a much more active way than we have done now. Now, as far as integration is concerned, I think also here, politicians must make clear that these are difficult things. They must be trustworthy. Right. They must be transparent. They must be frank.
Volker Stanzel, I just want to bring in
solutions when there aren't any.
Volker Stanzel, I just want to bring in Asif Arif. Volker comes up with a point about European involvement in ending the wars in Syria and the unstable Middle East. Is this a direct result, the terror threat that we've seen, and of course the migration crisis, of European inaction to solve the crisis in the Middle East? Or is it actually a result of success in fighting ISIL and reducing their territory in the last couple of years, so they strike out in Europe, which of course is softer targets?
Well, I think Daesh in Syria is losing a lot of key major areas over there. So basically, they understand, they really much understand that European Union is currently under Brexit, for example, which is destabilizing Europe. Rather they want to say yes or no, it is a big matter. So in that perspective, what leads to Daesh is, because they are losing on the ground, they said, okay, let's go into the European Union and to destabilize their democracy. So, of course, the long-term solution seems to be the better one. The more implication in the Middle East in order to solve through our democratic arms, I mean, through diplomatic channels and through all the fairness and justice that we need to apply in this region in order to solve all this matter, because we have two types of solution over this crisis. Either you solve the problem of Middle East in a more general way, and then you can stop the incoming, the mass incoming of refugees in Europe, or you are not solving the real issue in the Middle East, and the people who are persecuted over there, they will come to Europe, and Europe has all the legal basis to welcome them. So. Right. I think this is you have to find a solution in these two options.
Matteo, final word. Migration coming into Europe solved by beating ISIL on the battlefield, but also winning the war of ideas?
Yes, it is about winning the war of ideas, and ultimately I think all this will be solved in Europe, not abroad. There is, of course, because of course there is the battle with ISIS and all that, and that's about fighting terrorism in the Middle East and so on. But this is a political issue and an issue of governance in Europe. European member states and European governments have to decide whether or not they are ready to give up some national sovereignty to a higher level, to the European institutions, to the European Union, in order to work together on pan-European answers to problems that are intractable and unmanageable at the national level.